Picture this. Tara is just 6 years old. She's from India. She was stopped in a US airport with a man claiming to be her uncle. After investigation, it was found that she was bought from her parents by a wealthy family in Manhattan to work as an unpaid domestic servant. Now picture this. Katya is 14. She's from Moldova. She was trafficked into the UK and forced into prostitution. She was found by officials at 18, and now an illegal adult, was repatriated to Moldova. But her traffickers tracked her down. They gang raped her, ripped out her front teeth, hung her from a tree, and forced her to dig her own grave. After this immense psychological trauma, she was re-trafficked and found by the same officials in the UK at 24. Today, I'll be talking about the very real, very painful realities of child trafficking. I look at Chapter 4 from Child Migration and Human Rights in a Global Age. It's written by Jacqueline Baba, a lawyer and lecturer in both law and politics at Harvard, so she writes from the perspectives of law and public policy. Now, Baba argues for the need to tackle child trafficking from the bottom up, from its root causes. Yet I want to narrow in on one point she makes in particular. Throughout the chapter, with a kind of frustration, she repeatedly emphasizes the vulnerability and dangers that trafficked children face upon repatriation, upon returning home. Here is where I'd like to hit pause. She claims repatriation is a problem, and she declares her best way to fix it. But what happens before this? What happens in the decision-making process that sends a trafficked child home? Baba presents us with the politics of displacement. The host country, the country of origin, actors and legislations, the NGOs involved. But I want to slow things down and look at one concept in particular. Home. Home for the trafficked child. And I do this with philosophy, more specifically, the philosophy of place. I consider Heidegger and Sartre's philosophy of place to look at Western conceptualizations of home. I compare these with Baba's politics of trafficked children throughout, but for more details on her chapter, please see the handout. I find that Western, state-centric decision-making continues to use a philosophy of place to navigate displaced children with life-threatening consequences. I demonstrate overall that the realities of trafficked children challenge these thinkers and their philosophies of place. First up is Heidegger. Heidegger famously says, "We do not dwell because we have built, but we build and have built because we dwell. That is, because we are dwellers." This means that while we do not need homes to dwell, it is because we are creatures who dwell that we can be at home. Home is very tied to familiarity and belonging. He claims that through the home, we have the possibility to be our most authentic selves. How, you may ask? Well, security in the home allows for familiarity, and familiarity leads to routine. Routine leads to distractions within the familiar and the comfortable of our home. In his eyes, this leads to an inauthentic being in the world. We inevitably get lost in the entities that surround us. But never fear, there is an option to be awakened from this. Disturbance and anxiety is what disrupts routine. It shakes the familiar. It reveals to us the eeriness of our routines. Taking away the familiar is what reveals to us our true, authentic selves. So for Heidegger, familiarity is not necessarily a good thing in the home. At all, really. Disturbance is necessary. It may be risky, threatening, or dangerous, but it's needed. It leads to a revelation of the self. I think trafficked children challenge his notion of dwelling, first of all. Malpass, a writer on displacement, addresses dwelling for displaced people. He says, "We dwell, yet we do not dwell. We belong to being, yet we are separated from being. We are in place, yet we find ourselves displaced. who are home yet nevertheless remain homeless. Trafficked children, to me, exist between these oversimplified binaries that Heidegger presents. Heidegger's view is that the key to finding your authentic self lies in the period where you return to the safe space of home after disruption. But what happens when familiarity is disruption? If home for these children is what is only meant to be Heidegger's temporary phase of anxiety, the Western conception of home as a place of belonging and familiarity, opportunity to find authenticity, doesn't apply so easily here. Because home is more often than not a place of distress for these children. It doesn't offer security or comfort, as Heidegger claims. You remember 6-year-old Tara, sold by her parents. She had scars on her back, while Katya faced incredible abuse right outside of her home. Perhaps opportunity to find authenticity lies elsewhere. We need to validate these children's voices so that they can learn to speak on their own conceptions of dwelling in home. Next is Sartre. For Sartre, freedom supersedes everything. In Being in Nothingness, Sartre claims, "I cannot but be free to take a place in the world." Sartre doesn't speak about displacement per se, but he does speak on exile. Exile as forced removal is still somewhat relevant to child trafficking. He would claim that no matter how negative trafficking can be, one always has the freedom of choice to at least try to escape. He compares exile to prison. He says, yes, naturally, you cannot just leave exile, just like a prisoner cannot just walk out of prison. The prisoner, however, always has the option of escape. In that way, he has the choice of being principally free. Sartre would say that freedom is always an option. But this conceptualization is extremely adult-centric. Is it an option for children who are unable to provide for themselves, especially an abused, traumatized one like 6-year-old Tara? They're young and have no independence to navigate their place in the world. The freedom of choice to at least try to escape, Sartre says. But escape to where? Trafficking for these children occurs in the most destructive sense. It is prison without exit, exile without a home country. They are unsafe everywhere, home or otherwise. Even if they escape in their host country, Baba says that they are at further risk of exploitation, a fact compounded by their irregular immigration status. So unsafe everywhere, they're excluded from every society. In some cases, they're under triple exile from their host state, family, and home state. For example, take the hill tribes of northern Thailand, who aren't recognized by the Thai state. Stateless and lacking Thai citizenship, the hill tribes of northern Thailand are not granted access to social services, education, or state employment. So daughters are often sold into prostitution because families cannot survive through legitimate means. Baba also shows that in some countries, trafficked children have humanitarian leave to remain lawfully in the country only until they reach the age of 18, when they legally enter adulthood. After, they lose any legal ground to remain. A false sense of autonomy and freedom is assumed with coming of age, a Sartrean presumption that they now have the freedom of choice. Overall, I have demonstrated that the realities of trafficked children challenge these thinkers and their philosophies of place. This includes Heidegger's assumptions of the home as a place of comfort and security, as well as Sartre's assumptions on freedom of choice. Baba claims repatriation is a problem, and she declares her best way to fix it. But to me, a problem she overlooks is the predominance of a Western epistemic paradigm at the decision-making level. State-centric decision-making continues to use Western conceptions of place in cases of displacement. This has life-threatening consequences, as Tara and Katya demonstrate. I would conclude that it is urgently necessary to create a space for these victims of displacement to enter the discussion table and develop their own philosophies of place that is inclusive of displacement realities. So my question to you is, How can we bring in the voices of children subalterns? Is it possible to do so? Thank you for listening.